So I'm here to talk more about general mental health, and I specifically work with a lot of women that come into my private practice when often they're, tired, they're depleted, and they're just feeling really stuck. So I'm really glad that we could be here tonight. And when we really take a step back with ourselves, from our roles and responsibilities, we start to realize how many different roles that we hold. So not only are we, a wife, a partner, a mom, a sister, and beyond, really. I think we play so many different roles, and it just becomes so natural in our day-to-day life. So we might start to feel or notice that the space we have for ourselves get tighter, messier, and oftentimes heavier over time. So this might not happen overnight, but as we go on, we feel that we take on a lot. And maybe we try to tell ourselves that things will be fine, right? Just wait till next week, it'll get better. Maybe it'll work out. And we often have a great life on the surface, and we all seem like we're all having it together. And maybe we try to think through our problems, hoping for something different, or we hope that next week will be better. So just until then. But really, when is that gonna happen? So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. When we try to create space for us, it can often feel bad. It can feel guilty that we're making the time just for ourselves. Like we're always not doing enough, or that someone always needs us in some type of way. So we might start to wonder that we kept it so well inside that only we know what it's really like. And we start to ask ourselves that, does anyone notice what we do for other people on a day-to-day basis? Does anyone care, and is it just me? Are often some of the questions that women come in to seek psychotherapy at times. And just because we carry it well and make it look easy doesn't mean that we want to all the time. And maybe it doesn't have to be this hard. So as a psychologist, I often see women step into my office when they're just feeling depleted and drained and often stuck, feeling like there's something wrong with them, that they can't carry it all, and that they can't do it all. And as our life changes throughout our lifespan, our identity and roles evolve. So when is it ever enough? What often drives stress and burnout is a strong sense of responsibility that we don't want to burden other people. It can also be a belief that we should do it all and that we fill in the gaps. It's just part of our job. As well as societal expectation and roles, as well as the guilt that we hold and the resentments that we carry over time don't just seem to fade. And they often build and repeat. So we often focus externally on everyone else's needs, and internally we feel depleted. So what can therapy really do for us? And depending on whether you have experience, or people often think that, just talking through our problems won't do a whole lot, this is what therapy can really help us, and creating space for you. And what I mean by that is creating internal boundaries of how we define ourselves and our roles. So sometimes this means that we get to say how much we do and to what extent. And these internal boundaries are often invisible. So sometimes we feel like we do a whole lot and not realize how far we really take it. Also, therapy can build your capacity for flexibility and connection to yourself and others. So this builds resiliency over time. as well as acting without the guilt and settling some of the uncertainties that we often all feel. And that can, over time be very draining as well when we're feeling like we can't act on those worries. As well as shedding off what you don't need. So depending on what stage of life you're at, sometimes we often carry a lot of grief, losses in a way, as well as responsibilities that we seem to just fit in. So take the space for yourself. And I always say that when we talk about mental wellness, it's not just knowing, but feeling that difference. So what I mean by this is, like, you could read a book, right? You could, go on TikTok, you could read about all these different things and strategies, but really feeling that difference within yourself and building that connection. And lastly, I hope in the short time that we spent together that we can be honest with how we really feel. And I know that oftentimes we put on this mask, or that, we just seem to kind of do it all and not complain. But deep down, sometimes we do feel like we're tired, right? And that I hope that we live a life that aligns with our values. Yeah, thank you. Okay, got it. Oh, you got your own? Okay.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, there we go. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm going to get myself organized. So I'm here to talk about ADHD and women. And it's I think, an interesting population. There's a lot of information on TikTok, and it's really out there. And I think at a lot of points, most women probably feel like they might have ADHD, but we don't, not all of us. So, all right. So first of all, just a brief review of what I'm going to talk about. Just what is ADHD? How does it present in women? What am I looking for if I'm actually seeing someone who might have ADHD, but what other stuff might be going on? There are some positive aspects to ADHD, and I'll often describe it as a bit of a gift, but there are parts to it that can cause some trouble, and that's when I get involved. And then, very briefly, just what does treatment look like for ADHD? So first of all, what is it? I think a key point is we call it a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means it's the way your brain was created. It was there pretty much the day you were born, and it gradually will show itself, and it has to show itself in childhood in some form. So what that means is when you're looking for it, you are exploring what was life like as a kid. And I'm doing a lot of digging into home, school, and then as you grow up, what was work like, what are relationships like? And it's not just, I think a concept that's really important is it's not just you did well in school, you don't have ADHD, or you got a degree, you're a high-functioning lawyer. What I realized in seeing a lot of patients is there's a lot of very high-functioning people. I joke that most of the emerge docs at the ALEC probably have ADHD. People definitely will gravitate towards fields that fit for them, where their gifts can kind of be enhanced. But there's a process. So I don't say, what were your grades? I say, well, how did you get there? What did school look like? What did university look like? What does life look like? You might be great at work, but what does it look like at home? So it's that pattern over time that is so important, and I think actually reveals if ADHD is there. So it involves three main areas. First one is inattention. So that's the, distractible, trouble focusing, making lots of mistakes, a zillion emails in your draft box because you're constantly having to check and check and check. Losing things. I've learned to ask patients, do you tend to misplace things? And I'll have patients who will say, I'm on my 36th bank card. And then I'll say, okay, I think we can move on to talk about other stuff like treatment. A huge one that I see is task completion. And that's, I think, where a lot of women will feel like they have ADHD, because I think everyone can experience having trouble getting tasks completed. And I'm looking at, in the classroom, did you have trouble getting your work done? At home, was there someone on you all the time? When you went to university, were you always doing things at the last minute? Do you have trouble listening? People say, I've told you this before, or partners, or people at work. So that's kind of where the inattention plays itself out. Impulsivity, blurting things out, trouble waiting your turn, not thinking things through, impulsive spending, impulsive eating, finding you might have annoyed someone when you said something you totally didn't mean to, it just came out without you thinking about it. And then there's hyperactivity, which we see a little bit less of. It tends to sort of dampen itself with time, but maybe very talkative, a feeling you can't sit still, trouble sitting through a movie, on the go, fidgeting. So those are the main things we'll see there. So when I see someone, my first thought when they're wondering if they have ADHD is, well, are these symptoms old? Were they there for a long time? Are they actually new and truly new? Or have they just sort of revealed themselves or unmasked themselves in some way? So that's where I will explore childhood function at school, in the playground, at home. So I'm asking again about, were you the kid that your chair was at the front of the class, or were you in the hallway most of the time? Did you do well in school because you're super bright? School has a lot of structure, but as you moved through school, things became harder and harder, and you had to do a lot more compensating. In the playground, I see the people who are like, I was a lot, jumping in, not playing by the rules, really fun, enthusiastic, but getting into trouble. And then at home, were you the kid who was always late, always barely making it to school on time, not saying when you were coming home, like the chores weren't getting done, needed a lot of reminding and structure. So then of course I'm going into, are they coming on, when you're older, and are they brand new? Well, if they're brand new and I don't see something that was there before, then it's not ADHD, it's probably something else. So that's when I'm looking, are you in a situation where it's actually been there all along, but you were able to compensate? And I sometimes hear from people, well, I talked to my doctor and they said, I'm not in school anymore, I don't really need to be treated. And I'm like, well, when you were in school, you had one job, to go to school. And then you'll go to university, you'll be working, you'll have a family, you'll have a household, you'll have aging parents, and suddenly all those strategies are just not enough, and that's when it can actually show itself more. But you will see that over the past years, they've been working very hard to manage. It just kind of reveals itself. Or it's possible that it's actually reflecting something else. Anxiety and depression can absolutely affect memory and concentration. Substance use, smoking a lot of cannabis is certainly not going to help with task completion and staying focused. Sleep apnea, thyroid issues, and then menopause and perimenopause can certainly affect focus and concentration and that kind of stuff. One thing I've realized, though, in seeing a lot of people who have ADHD is that I see it, there's a lot of gifts that come along with it, and people can be incredibly successful. And I think we're only beginning to recognize, with children in school, that you can have very successful kids with ADHD. You just have to figure out how to teach kids with ADHD or how to coach kids with ADHD. And what I've seen is there can be a lot of enthusiasm, creativity, excellent problem solving, and crisis management. That's why I think most of the emerge docs probably have ADHD. They love less predictable environments. They don't have to have the same schedule every day, and in fact, they're kind of okay with having things be different every day. They're good at seeing the big picture and sort of looking at a big project. Probably not so good at making that project happen if you don't have someone to kind of delegate to. But thinking outside of the box, and there's an enthusiasm for trying new things and being open to new opportunities. But there are definitely costs. So there's the difficulty with follow-through. So having big ideas, starting big projects, but really struggling to get it done. The stress that's associated with procrastination, and it can often present with a lot of anxiety. I also see people where there's actually a degree of dysphoria with feeling incompetent. They're not incompetent. It's not an IQ thing. They can be incredibly high-functioning people, but you're constantly getting the message and you're looking at your colleagues and friends and family and thinking, how come it's so easy for them? And for me, I have to work so hard and it's just the laundry. You know, like these little things can build up, and that feeling of being less productive can lead to feeling down on yourself as well. Of course, it can have an impact on school and work performance, and productivity at home, and relationships. So a lot of my patients will say, I've gotten some feedback from some friends that it annoys them when I'm late all the time, or I don't get back to them because I saw the text and I forgot, and they're irritated with me. Not following through on tasks can lead to friction in relationships, projects that aren't done. And what I see is compensatory strategies can work in one environment, like work. People have strategies, routine, there's structure, but when you get home, there's just no energy left. And all that stuff gets poured into work and stuff at home doesn't get done. And that leads into the other side of things that I've recognized more and more in my work at the bariatric obesity surgery clinic. I didn't realize that average adult population, they say about 4% ADHD. The bariatric obese population, about 24%. And what we realize is all that work is going to work and home and, parenting, but people with ADHD are not meal planning. They're missing hunger cues, they're skipping meals, they're overeating at night, and they're grazing all the time. They're not making time for exercise because they're scrambling. So there's a lot of costs in terms of health. They're probably not remembering to take their medication, or they're missing appointments. So that's a part that became increasingly noticeable to me in doing that kind of work. So treatment is actually quite simple. Gold standard treatment is with stimulant medication. And what we're doing is we're getting the front part of the brain that is just a little bit less active to be more active. So the planning, the organizing, the focusing, the filtering stimuli coming in, but also filtering stuff coming out. Blurting, emotional regulation, impulse control. They're a nice medication to work with because they work very quickly, and we either know pretty quickly if they work or they don't. I mean, you have to be careful with caffeine intake. That's one thing you always want to think about, because I'll see people with ADHD, and they're the ones who say, I can drink coffee all night long, and I can fall asleep if I have coffee. And I'm like, yeah, because you've calmed your brain down, and you can finally go to bed. And of course, there's behavioral strategies and psychological strategies that I don't get the opportunity to do as much, but actually I learn a lot from my patients who tell me what works for them. And it can be things like, if you're cleaning a room, you leave a basket at the door and you don't leave the room, because if you leave the room, you'll see something else and get distracted and never finish. Or having lists, having the list for the 5-minute tasks and having a list for the longer tasks. And that way you don't get derailed and you actually are more productive with your time. Creating even, I saw an Instagram, which I thought was kind of funny, but there was a strategy where you turn the tap on and fill a pot, and that sense of urgency that people with ADHD really like would lead them to run around the house and do a whole bunch of things before the pot was full. So you're actually creating a sense of urgency, because people will say, oh, I just need a bit of the fire, and I'm like, yeah, which is why you're doing it the night before it's due. Other things like imposing structure. That's why sometimes kids in school, in kindergarten or elementary school, there's a lot of structure. Things are done a certain day, parents are on them for homework. It's how can you impose that in your life as you're getting older and running a household? So doing things on the same day, or always shopping on the same day. So trying to create that structure. Even things like having a 7-day calendar instead of a 30-day calendar. A lot of people will say, what's the point of the 30-day calendar? Like, I need the 7 days and then I'll get things done. 30 days, it's way too far ahead. And then there's, from a psychological perspective, this is just one example, but kind of challenging those distorted thoughts of, I need the fire to get this done. It's okay, I'll get it done. Yeah, I always do. The procrastination, that kind of thing. So overall, in summary, I could talk about this all night probably. Many, many women can identify with features of ADHD, but it does not mean we all have it. And it can have many positive aspects, but it can also have the negatives. And it can be missed if you focus on the results. It's important to look at the process and the strategies and what's actually happening kind of under the surface. And I think a good example is I have tons of lawyers and physicians and very high-functioning people who someone would say they can't have ADHD, they're really, really high-functioning, and I'm like, well, there's a cost somewhere. And treatment can be very helpful, and it involves both medication but also sort of behavioral and psychotherapy strategies. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Anybody else feel really seen after listening to Dr. Bondurant? Me too. Now please join me in welcoming Lindsay Robertson. Vice President of Communications, Marketing and Brand, who will be guiding our Q&A session with our speakers. And just a quick reminder, while our experts are here to provide valuable insights, they are unable to offer personal medical advice during tonight's event. Now let's get started.
Thank you. It doesn't matter. Do you want to sit there and then I can talk? Perfect. Thank you so much to our presenters, Lisa, Dr. Bondurant, for the insights you've shared. I know, like Ajoma said, when I say many of us feel what you just said, and it really lands deeply. At this point, we're going to shift into a conversation, which is exciting to have. A space to reflect a little more, dig a little deeper, and give voice to the quiet questions that live in many of us. We've heard about the invisible weight many women carry, the expectations, the exhaustion, the pressure to show up perfectly, even when we're unraveling inside. And we've heard how these challenges sometimes mask what might actually be ADHD. Especially in women whose strengths have helped them get by, if that resonates with anyone out there, for decades without a diagnosis. So I'm here to explore what this really means in our day-to-day lives and our relationships and how we care for ourselves. Thank you again for being here, and let's start with you, Lisa. You spoke about the invisible emotional load that women carry. How can women begin to recognize when this burden is becoming harmful rather than manageable?
I would say that, sometimes a mental health kind of checkup with a psychologist, even once a month for therapy, would be a good idea, instead of coming in when things are kind of getting worse, or that when something's really happening in your life. So I often see this sense of urgency when they come into my office, that something needs to be fixed, or that they just can't do it anymore. And I would say the kind of red flags, I would say, is that when you're feeling like you're kind of withdrawing from yourself, or you're often feeling like you're not acting like yourself. So it's kind of this feeling like you're distancing yourself from either the people around you or even internally as well. So that can present in various ways, as in depression, right, where you have low mood or you feel like you don't want to do anything because you've done a lot, or heightened anxiety, where it feels like everything is urgent and you can't get through anything in a day. That, I would say, those are kind of the red flags that I see.
A similar question to you, Dr. Bondurant. I was going to ask that you highlighted how ADHD in women, that masked symptoms for maybe years. So any additional red flags or anything that women should watch for, or hope that the people who surround them watch for and can maybe flag for them?
I think in that regard, I would say a little bit similar, because when you find yourself quite frantic and overwhelmed, I've noticed that often patients will present with features what they think are anxiety, but it's actually, I say, well, what are you anxious about? And it's task completion, getting things done, missing something, not being somewhere on time. The content of that will make me think this might be ADHD. Or again, feeling down on yourself, poor self-care, you're getting feedback from others that you're not performing. So sometimes it's monitoring your own symptoms, but also getting feedback from others that actually leads to them coming my way.
Lisa, many women feel guilt, I think, about creating space for themselves. I think all of us here probably resonate with that. I know I do. What are some practical first steps that they can take to overcome that guilt in daily life?
Yeah, so I would say that guilt is a universal feeling that we all have. The emotion itself is not necessarily bad, or it doesn't mean that you have any kind of illness at times either, though diagnosis is so common nowadays, I feel like. So I would say some practical steps would be first to validate how you feel. And what I mean by that is that I wouldn't try to fight the feeling. So sometimes that can create even more, I would say, more negative emotions at times. And validating yourself might just look like, you're feeling this way on this day, and that's okay. And to kind of lessen that burden for yourself instead of trying to fix this emotion in this moment. I would say that would be a start. As well as reach out, of course, when you feel like you really need it. I feel that proactive mental health support is really important. And I feel like talking to a psychologist, even a few sessions, can make such a big difference from what I've seen, that you might not need ongoing treatment necessarily. So, yeah.
Dr. Bondurant, how can we differentiate between ADHD and the other conditions that you had posted? So things like anxiety, depression, symptoms of perimenopause. How should women know when it's maybe leaning the way that there should be a diagnosis?
Well, I think, first of all, you can absolutely have both. So you can have anxiety and ADHD and depression. So that's something I always keep in mind. I think for me, it really comes right down to, let's say, I think you have to screen for it. And I guess that's what I worry about, is there's a lot of talk about ADHD, and you can just about go on and get like a virtual app and fill out a few forms and suddenly you have it. My first thought is always, well, is this actually ADHD or is this actually anxiety? So I have to ask a lot of questions. And that means, well, when you feel anxious, what are you actually worrying about? And If you're feeling down, are you feeling down because you've got some feedback about performance, or it's that whole dysphoric picture and sort of incompetence? So really, it means being mindful that those other things are there and asking a lot of questions. But it's I think if you were distinguishing those things, it's the content. Is what you're worrying about a reflection of being inattentive and disorganized, or is it that you're worrying about safety and something bad happening? That's a different kind of anxiety. In terms of perimenopause and menopause, I think we're only now just getting a better appreciation for how much that affects mood, anxiety, focus, concentration, memory, all that kind of stuff. And that's where I'll ask lots of questions about, well, when did you start noticing this? If you started noticing it at the same time as you started to have those kind of perimenopausal symptoms, but you didn't have it before, this is new, then that's usually a clue for me that this is different. This is more perimenopausal or something.
Lisa, you mentioned internal boundaries as the key to wellness, or one of them, for sure. Could you expand on how women can define those boundaries without feeling like they're letting others down? I think you touched on it a little bit, but maybe some tips or tricks on how we can all, lessen, I always say the mom guilt, but I think it comes in lots of forms.
Yeah, for sure. I feel, again, I could talk about this all day as well, so I'll keep it short. But we often start with kind of physical boundaries, right? So with how much time we spend doing, activities or go to work, you make the time, really, right? But when we talk about psychological care, we also touch on internal boundaries as well. So what that means is kind of like this filter between yourself and others and the world around you. And that often goes kind of unexamined for a really long time until we kind of burn out, which means that we often give a lot more than we give back to ourselves. So some tips, I guess, or strategies is even just noticing kind of how we're sitting each day, because that can be different. And our capacity switches as well. So you might notice like midweek you start to kind of feel just tired, or your thoughts are starting to get more negative, or you just don't have enough in you at times. So I would say regular kind of self-care, and that doesn't just mean taking a bath. I would say, like, anytime I think about self-care, but also really taking care of your emotions in that way. I would say have supportive people around you that really understand your experiences, can also help as well. So those are some day-to-day things. But I do also want to mention that as we grow and evolve in our day-to-day life, sometimes the things that have happened to us, we also carry that as well. So some, childhood things, right? As well as our belief that we have to do it all, and we keep pushing and pushing. So sometimes it just means taking that step back and, of course, saying no at times, but knowing how far we want to go in each of our roles is really important as well.
Wonderful. Dr. Bondurant, there's often stigma around ADHD and medication. How can we start to reframe that conversation around treatment, especially for those of us who have kind of come through, I'm going to say 35 plus, I'm like well over that. But I think we were raised in a world where mental health medication carried a bit of a stigma with it. So how can we start to reframe that conversation?
That one's a little tricky. I work at the ALEC, I work in the Emerge, and we're always talking about stimulants in a very different category. And it's in the news, so I know when I'm talking to my patients about stimulant medication that they're thinking methamphetamine, especially if I say it's dextroamphetamine. So I'm very open about it, and I just put that on the table. I said, that word can bring with it a lot of other thoughts and other scenarios. And then I describe it, coffee's a stimulant. That's why I ask a lot of my patients how much coffee they drink, and if I put them on something to decrease the caffeine intake. So I think just by giving them clear information and actually talking about it and being open about what you think they might have concerns about, it reduces the stigma just by literally confronting those myths or the extra weight that word has. And I think that's what I do when I see patients. I'm already prepared to have that as part of the discussion.
Wonderful. In a similar vein, Lisa, therapy is often seen too as a last resort or something that we're ashamed to admit we go to or not, comfortable talking about in a public forum like this. What are some misconceptions about therapy that maybe prevent women from accessing help earlier, and how can we address them?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the common misconceptions is that you might feel like you don't need it until you really do. So there's so many cognitive ways that we cope by telling ourselves that things are fine, or it's not that bad, kind of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think we all say that to ourselves, right? But it gets to a point where it starts to bubble over, and it feels like, oh my gosh, like now I really can't push through my day. So I would say that if you're feeling like you're kind of at that point, find a therapist that matches, your style and really bond with in that way. Like I would say the rapport is really important when you pick a therapist, and someone that really gets you. So, when you're looking for a therapist, there's quite a bit of us as well out there, but when you read their profiles and that resonates with you, that would be a really good start, just to get yourself through the door, right? And I call it kind of like this unraveling process as you peel back each of the layers. But therapy doesn't have to be, years long, right? You kind of let me know what your goals are, and we will get you there. I think one of the misconceptions too is that, you're lying on my couch or something and for years at a time. But contemporary psychotherapy is definitely not like that anymore. And it can be goal-focused if that's what you're looking for. And it could also be kind of in and out as well. So I have a lot of clients that come for a couple months when they need it, just to get over, what they're going through, and then come back years later as well. But to start that kind of relationship where someone knows you and someone is there when you need it could be a really good start as well.
Wonderful. We talked a little bit about some of the negatives, but you spoke, Dr. Bondurant, about some of the positive traits associated with ADHD. So how can women learn to harness those traits that are positive, frame them as strengths, and use them in their personal and professional lives?
Well, I think sort of instinctively some people already make use of their positives, so it's finding jobs that you like, recognizing, I think, that you like unpredictability or you like new things. So that's just being mindful of that, to sort of harness that energy. Some people with ADHD are incredibly sort of focused on organization. It's almost like that they swing the other way. And I'm always like, well, you need to have a little bit of a middle ground. But I guess using some of those strategies, they can be the most organized person in the room in some ways. So to find those positives, I guess you have to recognize it, but I don't know that they often get those messages from people. And I don't know that they hear it, because these are people that have often grown up being told, settle down, pay attention, you're running late, why are you late? So it's not easy to hear those positives, and I think one of the things that's come out more and more now about ADHD is, recognizing that it's not all bad. I hate kind of using the word disorder all the time, but there's some really great aspects to it, and maybe more awareness of that will let people with ADHD be a little bit, sort of give themselves a break for those things and actually celebrate the things that are positives.
Amazing. Like Lindsay, you talk too much in class. That was one I got constantly. You're distracting the other children. You know, it's not a bad thing when
But
you're the director of
social,
when
right?
you're now in communications, it all works together, right? So, Lisa, how do societal expectations of doing it all kind of uniquely impact women today? I think, you know, now more than ever, we're all pulled in a million directions, not to mention, you know, the pull from our pocket and our phones, and the pull from our families and our jobs and there was a time when women stayed home and still had much on their plate, but now that's pretty rare, I think. You know, we have women being pulled in a million directions. So how can we challenge those norms or really kind of identify that doing it all maybe doesn't mean that you're succeeding, and maybe it's okay to not do it all sometimes?
Yeah, really great question. I would say, obviously, this looks very different for each and every one of us. But what I often see is that we're over-functioning in all of our roles that we play. And once you start filling in that gap, it can be really hard to start saying no, and that's a direct form of, you know, setting limits. But also pulling back just feels like guilty, right? It just feels like you can't. So that's what I often work with in therapy with them, is that what are those ways that we could start pulling back, whether it's emotionally investing in it, time, right? And really taking a look at how much we really give in each and every one of our roles. I would say that might start with a conversation with your husbands, right? So you start with often the relationships in your life, for sure. And also expressing what we're needing can be really hard depending on what we grew up with, and it could feel like we don't even know what our own needs are until we start paying attention more internally. I would say the broader scope of societal expectations, I see that evolving. I see that, you know, we have full-time jobs and we're doing it all at home as well. So we're almost doing 2 shifts is what I kind of call that, right? But I would say that there are ways to have more control internally, I would say. And the rest will kind of fall into place, is how I think of that. So, yeah.
No. You can always, I'm sure. We could talk, I'm sure, for days about this. Dr. Bondurant, many women, and you touched on this in your presentation, feel that ADHD, and I know even in my own immediate friend group, the symptoms really only presented themselves or became obvious in midlife. Is that an actual change, or you talked about that unmasking kind of idea of lifelong patterns? Why does that happen? Like, why does it feel, and I can only speak for myself and my friend group, that all of a sudden there's a lot of people in my immediate circle who feel like a bit of an awakening here?
Well, I think there's a few parts to that. I see a lot of women at the bariatric surgery clinic, and what I realized is we actually didn't even have the diagnostic criteria to diagnose the quiet daydreamer in the classroom. And that's where a lot of women were. They weren't running, jumping, playing, causing trouble. So they didn't come to attention of the teachers. And so there's that category. They really have ADHD, it just wasn't noticed and wasn't even on anyone's radar. Then there's the other group that, you know, you have a lot of structure, you have ADHD, it's in the background, but you go to university and suddenly you don't have the same structure. Your term paper's due in 4 months. You do not have someone on your case if your homework's not being done. And you have a much less defined setting, and it starts to blossom a bit. I see those people, they're like, yeah, I got diagnosed with depression in university and I had to take a break. Or I'm like, well, I wonder if that all happened because of the ADHD. But then there's the group that you're referring to, you know, and I think that it's because there is a group that it isn't there, but there are so many demands. And I'm not sure about anyone else, but it's not easy in today's society to say no to stuff as a woman. And, you know, I think of small things like sending an email saying no and trying to be nice and putting an exclamation mark at the end and then being like, why did I just do that? Because I felt bad saying no, but my male colleague next to me probably didn't feel that way. Or, you know, there's some TikTok video of a girl who does like kung fu moves and practices saying no, and I showed that to all my female residents. I said, you need to learn this. And so we say yes to a lot of things. It's not easy to say no. We have kids, we have families, we have households, we have work commitments, we have aging parents. And so we don't have task completion. We're not doing stuff that we want. So I think that contributes to it. But when you look back at it, it's almost more of an issue with being able to set boundaries than actually having ADHD. And then there's a group that really does have ADHD and just compensated forever, and suddenly it's just not working because you can't do it all. And all those strategies just suddenly fall away. So I think it just kind of shows itself more.
Anyone else feel seen when she said 4 months to do a paper and now it's the night before and I haven't started yet? Anybody? Okay, good. I'm with my people. Good. Lisa, what are the signs that a woman might be externally functioning but internally depleted? And how can her circle of friends, because I think there's all of us here who maybe don't just see this in ourselves, but we look beside us and around a table at girls' night and we think, I don't know if she's okay. What can we, what should we look for? How can we help? How can we interject and make sure they get the help they need?
I would say that, with change, it is hard. So you might offer the suggestion that they go and seek help, but when they're not feeling ready, I wouldn't push it more than that, right? I would say as a friend or a colleague, just even acknowledging that, like, hey, this is really tough, like, we get it, can be validating enough for them to maybe take that first step. I get that with therapy, it is quite in a private setting, so people typically reach out when they're feeling ready, and even that takes a lot of courage to start looking for a therapist. So I would say that, I wouldn't overly be positive. That might be invalidating to some people. And what I mean by that is saying, oh, you'll kind of feel better, or, yeah, like, I hope you, I hope that you feel better and things will be better, can be experienced as a bit invalidating, especially when they're already internally not feeling very seen in that way. So to kind of lessen that burden, I would say that just acknowledging the little things that they're doing, right? Just even showing up can be a lot for some people. But truly, we might not really know what goes on, kind of behind closed doors, or what we really carry day in and day out. So, yeah.
Dr. Bondurant, what role does self-compassion play? If we're thinking about all of this, we've talked a little bit about friends supporting us, but what about us supporting us? So, especially for women who have spent years thinking they're failing, or they're falling short, or they're not good enough, how can that self-compassion piece play into the healing?
I think a lot of what we've been talking about today, for me, comes down to being able to say no and actually practicing it. And I think that I might joke about the TikTok or the Instagram, but what that's showing is that we need a script to help us practice saying no, or practice sending that email that declines, or says, I actually, can't make that 9:30 p.m. Saturday night hockey game because I have plans already. And so I think the start for self-care often means preparing and being prepared to say no to things, and then actually sticking with those activities that are there for you and your well-being, and trying to tell yourself that I'm actually better when I do those things. You know, referencing talking with friends and that, you know, it's not easy to get together when you have all these demands, and I know often the experience is you get, your gathering gets put to the side. Well, how do you know if your friend's not doing well if you're not going out and talking and making a commitment to do those things? So I think the biggest thing is really carving out that space and sticking to it and being prepared to say no. And you're still gonna feel guilty probably, but it'll get better with time.
I read a book once by Shonda Rhimes, who created Grey's Anatomy and all those great shows. It was like her yes year. Maybe we need a no year. Do you think? You could write it. We could work that. Lisa, can you speak to how mental health needs really evolve across women's life stages? So in a similar way, like we experience different stresses, I think, in our 20s, our 30s, our 40s, and so on. So maybe just a little bit of a comment on how we can really stay attuned or tuned into those changes as we age.
Yeah, for sure. So I started out my career, I would say, working with children and teens at first. So I see kind of that developmental stage as we evolve. And I would say that as therapy is more normalized, in my private practice, I'm seeing more young adults come in a lot earlier. So even in their 20s, you know, they're establishing their career, their relationships. There's also some foundational kind of pieces that we explore, as well as our identity, and building upon those layers as we grow. I also see women in their 30s as well, where, you know, things that start, you know, things that made sense before start to feel a bit shaky or uncertain. So maybe they're entering marriage, right, and navigating that, as well as aging parents at times, right, as well as loss and grief is also a really common theme that I see in my practice. And I would just say that as we age, we tend to take on more roles and not knowing how to put some of them down in some ways. And we don't really talk about it amongst us as well at times, because there's really no setting sometimes to do that. You know, when we're out in public spaces, we tend to kind of be like, hey, how are you, right? And we can only get through so much. So I would say that around 30, 35, right, when you're considering kids as well, establishing a family, career, those are just some of the aspects that we confront a lot of ourselves, really. As well as I see women in their 40s and 50s, I would say mostly when their parents are aging and you're slowly grappling with some of those caregiving pieces, as well as grief and loss. I know I say that a lot, I feel like, but it is a theme that, you know, common issue that people come to therapy for. But I also see a lot of premenopause symptoms that present like anxiety and ADHD as well. So, you know, I often screen for, you know, which is which as well, but sometimes we've just been holding on for so long that we wait till we're, you know, late 30s or 40s to really talk about it. Yeah, I would say those are common, you know, vary across your lifespan.
Dr. Bondurant, for women who suspect they might have ADHD, maybe you're here tonight, maybe you're seeing some signs or learning some things, what should they, I think we all have a bit of nerves about seeking assessment or talking to someone or addressing it. What should they expect in that diagnostic process? And is there a way to prepare? I think honesty is important, but sometimes we get into doctors' offices and we lock up and we don't know what to say. So any advice for those who might be seeking a diagnosis?
Well, I think part of that, unfortunately, comes down to stigma. And this idea, people say, the first things they'll say to me sometimes is, I'm not crazy, or they're seeing a shrink. And I think that we are getting better at just talking about it by having today and sort of naming it. That's step one. Talking to your family physician and feeling safe that you can share it is important as well. Actually getting in to see someone for assessment, I think, is actually a bigger barrier than people wanting the assessment, because there's just not enough of us out there. There's a lot of kind of gimmicky stuff for ADHD, these online things where someone makes you fill out a bunch of scales, but I spent about an hour asking a lot of questions. So I guess trying to see it as I'm no different when I talk about my meds than going to see someone about blood pressure. I say, well, my meds, I don't want you to stop your blood pressure meds abruptly. I also don't want you to stop these meds abruptly, but it doesn't mean you're addicted. So I think when someone comes to the door to see me, I try to normalize things. We're having a conversation. And I hope they feel that they can share things with me. I think they typically do. But if you're asking about what would they expect in assessments, I ask a lot of questions. And I want to know what happened as a kid with you in the classroom. I want to know a little bit about stuff at home. I'm just going to ask a lot of questions and be curious. And that's what you can expect. But it's not that I'm there to make you feel uncomfortable or, have you delve into something and kind of, people will say, oh, don't read my mind, or that's not what I'm there for. I ask the same questions that a cardiologist would ask to get a better sense of what's going on with their heart. And so coming in that way and feeling maybe it's a little bit more normal than something kind of mysterious.
I think that's so important. We all aren't ashamed to say we need medication for something that's physically wrong. So hopefully tonight has helped everyone understand that there's nothing wrong with saying we need some medication for something that might be going on in our minds. I think if you had asked me about my childhood, my mom was a teacher and she put me out in the hallway multiple times for talking too much in class. My final question I love to ask both of you, because I think I know it's in everyone's pockets and purses, devices. The cell phones, the ability to have information in our pockets, not just information, but, I had a conversation with a staff member today, and we talked about using ChatGPT as a therapist. We talked about having AI in our pockets. But not just that, but the demands, the beeping, the alerts, how do devices contribute or maybe help, but maybe hinder these issues as well?
So I would say that each time you kind of switch in and out of different tasks, that requires a different kind of cognitive load. So if we really start to think about how many times we, look at a screen and then we look at our phone or read this, every time we do that, that takes a psychological kind of load on our minds. And the scientific term is executive functioning, right? So each time we switch in and out of a task, or we inhibit certain stimulus as well. So sometimes we might notice different sensory things going on for us. And it could even be just the lighting or the temperature. It could be very, we might not even notice it, right? But it all takes such a mental load for us to switch in and out all the time. So I would say that one of the ways that I tell some of my clients is to be kind of more mindful of how much you're taking on at one time. So we all love to multitask, but sometimes that actually decreases our efficiency at times. And even, the notifications that we have on our phones can be so distracting, and it could feel like, oh my gosh, I gotta respond right away, right? As well as dealing with some of our anxiety related to needing to always be on all the time. So we could really turn some of those things off And we really haven't had this much distractions, I feel like, in some ways, until we really start to notice. Yeah, so, and also I would say that as we age, there are normal cognitive changes. And you could probably speak more to this, but you know, our working memory might not be as quick or efficient as we were in our 20s. And we might like grieve that in some ways, right? But some of our normal changes that we experience, as well as hormones, make such a difference as well. So those are the physiological changes, but psychologically, I would say that we also experience normal aging with our attention span as well. So,
yeah. Anything to add?
Oh, well, devices, I mean, I will say, as you know, I'm a physician and I spend most of my time walking from unit to unit. So my device it's like a computer. I can be incredibly efficient and get things done and check email. But it can also be a sort of a terrible thing for me in terms of setting limits and saying no, because someone has access to me all the time, or I feel like I'm supposed to be doing something all the time. And so I think in that case, devices have really forced us to, in a lot of ways, like you have to make a concerted effort and almost have a plan for what you're going to do to avoid falling into that. And I mean, I'm a terrible email checker, and everyone around me knows. And I will go an entire weekend without checking my email because I know that if I do, I'm going to start seeing something and then I'm going to worry. Or I actually don't check Instagram. I have it, but I wait for good friends and family to curate the good ones and send them to me because I know if I go on, I will lose an hour. And it might be a good hour, but I can only do that once a week. So for me, devices are great, but I've recognized I have to set these sort of semi-arbitrary rules, or else they are going to cause trouble for me. And I think the same thing goes for kids. If you talk about ADHD, it's extra hard for them to pay attention, and adults. And if you're sitting at work and you have your phone sitting right there, you're not great at time and awareness of time, and you're going to look away, and an hour later you've been looking, I don't know, scrolling websites. So I think it's forcing us to actually make very specific behavioral changes, and if you don't, it'll creep up on you and you'll be kind of controlled by it.
I know do not disturb mode is a lifesaver for me, and I have to go into it, as well as Siri reminders. If I don't ask Siri to remind me things, I won't remember, so I get both sides of that for sure. That's all the questions we had. I think we're right on time. So I will invite Ijoma back up to the stage, and she will bring this presentation home.
Are there any questions in the room? Oh, nice. I'm coming.
Okay, so my question is, do you have any recommendations for how women can advocate for themselves when they know that something is inherently not right? Because we're unfortunately still in a time where women are quite often dismissed from their health provider, like their health provider will dismiss their concerns and just send them away with Valium or something like that. And and it's not, we're in the times that we're in, it's not like you can just easily go and seek a second opinion on your care. So do you have any recommendations?
It honestly depends on your practitioner, I feel like there's such a variety of experiences, I find. But I would say psychologists are we spend a little more time to get to know our clients, and that's just how the system is set up sometimes. So I know in private practice, I do have that privilege to really get to know my clients and really sift through what is what, right? And I can also speak on their behalf to call their physician or a psychiatrist if needed. But I would say the common experience has been that, it's unfortunate that our symptoms get minimized or dismissed, and I would say be persistent, really. If you really feel that there's something more going on, really seek help, and it's okay to get a second opinion, honestly, especially with assessments as well, I feel like. And I could say that if they just make you fill out a questionnaire and diagnose you, that's typically a red flag in my practice, I would say. So really, have them ask those questions to differentiate the different symptoms, right? I feel like I often see more anxiety than actual ADHD nowadays. So, yeah.
Coming from my perspective, it's definitely something I hear quite a bit from patients. And I see some patients at a clinic where they've been referred for obesity, and I'm just part of the process. That's actually easier because we look for it, I get to see them, and they didn't have to have that conversation with their family physician of, I think I have ADHD, or I'm struggling and I feel anxious. So with those patients, I know there's physicians out there, and it's unfortunate. Sometimes we're the most stigmatizing in a way, and we're still working on that. What I would say is if you're having that experience, I would recommend going in armed with information, because you have a very busy practitioner and they might make a quick judgment. So if you come in and you say, I wonder if I have ADHD, I've done a little bit of reading and I've noticed this, and this, I'm envisioning that family doc writing the letter already. It's easy. You want to make it as easy as possible. If you've laid your case out, you've done the research, I think you've made it easier for them, and then they put the referral in. If they don't do it the first time, I think you go back. But definitely there's people out there. I do see a lot more family physicians actually initiating treatment, sending patients my way with really nice reviews of symptoms and saying, I think this might be what's going on. So I think we're making gains, not just with ADHD, but with depression and all that too. But I'd say go in with information and advocate for yourself with information. It makes it easier for them to say, well, maybe there is something